The views or opinions expressed in the following broadcast do not necessarily reflect those of staff or management of DSE-TV. Viewer discretion is advised.
And another way that abortion touches us is through the economy. If you think of the millions of babies that have been aborted, right now the young men and young women who were aborted back in 1973, 74, 75, they would be in their mid-30s. They would be paying taxes. They would be producing jobs. They would have families who would be consumers of products. They would be paying into the Social Security system so that those of us who are senior citizens would not have to worry about whether that check was going to come. So abortion touches us through our lack of people, the people that have been aborted. And because of that, we will never be able to measure the talents that have been lost, the ideas that are gone. You know that for the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk about Steve Jobs and his death and how important he was to us and to our economy. And those of you that have iPods and iPhones and iPads and so on, you realize the importance of someone like Steve Jobs. And probably about, I would say maybe a month before his death, there was a piece that was circulating the internet that was entitled, "Steve Jobs is a genius, but even geniuses need to be born." And that article then went on to talk about the fact that Steve Jobs, who was born in 1955, he was adopted. How many realize that he was adopted? Well, those of you that have read the article, you realize that in 1955, his mother was an unmarried college student, a grad student, and her father did not want her to marry the father of her baby, the baby, and so they placed the baby for adoption. Now, if he would have been conceived in 1975, 20 years later, what are the chances that Steve Jobs would have survived? Probably unlikely. You know, that number of abortions that Pat mentioned and that all of you, I think, realize, that number is so huge. 50 million, at least 50 million, over 1 million a year. And how can you visualize that? You know, we kind of put our arms around smaller numbers. You know, we can have a great deal of sympathy for a lost child. We think of the little baby right now in Kansas City, Missouri, the little baby Lisa, and we can be very concerned about that. But how do you visualize 1 million a year, or even more than that, 50 million a year? And so I always try to think of examples, and I think this is one example that will help us visualize it. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C. and you've seen the Vietnam War Memorial, the big wall? Well, if you haven't been there, it looks like most of you have, that you certainly have seen pictures of it. And when you see that wall, you know, that long, dark wall, and you see the inscriptions of those names, about 58,000 men died in the Vietnam War. And so you see 58,000 lines. Now, if we build a monument like that to the unborn, it would stretch from Muskegon along north, along US 31 to Ludington. And then at Ludington, it would turn around and come all the way back. So think of that on that wall, line after line after line of babies, their names engraved in that wall. Amazing. But I spoke here 5 years ago, and I dug my speech in, and I used that same example. About 5 years ago, it wasn't 100 miles from here to Ludington and back again. It was 80 miles. So in 5 years, we've increased another 20 miles. And as abortion is legal, it would continue, that wall would have to continue to be built piece by piece. So that's what we're seeing in this country. Such a waste of human beings. And back in 1973, when abortion became legal, everyone said, not everyone, but the pundits said, it's going to be limited. It's only going to be for those rare cases. We're only going to have a few. But instead, we've seen the few become more and more. Instead of being rare, and Pat mentioned this too, instead of being rare, women are having not one abortion, but 2 abortions, repeat abortions, or 3 abortions. I think it was 2 years ago, there was an autobiography this woman wrote. She called her autobiography Impossible Motherhood. She wrote about her 15 abortions in 15 years, an abortion every year. So abortion, once it becomes legal, it's simply another choice. And babies are treated as products, something we can purchase, something we can throw away. Last August, in the New York Times, they published a story that was entitled, "The 2 minus 1 Pregnancy." That's 2 minus 1 pregnancy. And this woman wrote about her own journey to have a child. She was 45 years old. She had gone through 6 years of fertility treatments. And the women in the audience will know that when it comes to fertility treatment, we're talking about something for 6 years expensive, inconvenient, and in some cases very painful. Well, after 6 years of treatment, she found herself pregnant. But now she had a dilemma. What was she going to do? She should be overjoyed, but she wasn't, because she was pregnant with twins, 2. And she didn't want twins. She only wanted 1. She did say, well, if I would have conceived naturally, if I wouldn't have had to go through all the fertility treatments, I wouldn't even think of aborting one of them. But because, in her words, the pregnancy was so consumerish, so like being a consumer to begin with, this became just another thing that we could control. And so she had a selective abortion, killed one of her babies.